Join EWTN on this special on-location presentation as the Catholic University of America and the Napa Institute present Human Ecology, integrating business and 125 years of Catholic social doctrine.
All right, our next speaker will be Dr. Robert Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is now the head of the very prestigious Catholic Studies Institute at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Prior to doing that, he was a professor of business at the University of St. Thomas and the former chair of the business school there. He has an important book called The Good That Business Does, related to the topic he's going to be addressing today. He has published widely, not just in the area of business, but also in the social encyclicals, Just War Theory, a variety, military ethics, and a variety of other related issues to culture, to the Catholic Church, to ethics, specifically in the area of business. He's going to be talking to us today about the links between virtue and prosperity. So, Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Father, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you today. And I want to just take a moment to thank the organizers of the conference, the sponsors of the conference, for putting together such a lovely program and taking such good care of us during these few days and in the run-up to the conference. And I also want to thank, I think particularly Andreas Widmer for giving me such a lovely topic to speak about with you today. First, I'd like to do just a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of theology with you, and then get into this subject about the link between virtue and prosperity. Here's the little bit of philosophy, a couple of definitions. Aristotle, 2,300 years ago, 2,400 years ago, defined wealth as the sum of those things that can be measured, whose value can be measured in money. The sum of those things whose value can be measured in money. Economists have a definition of wealth, and others do, but I kind of like Aristotle's definition, and I want to ask you to tuck that in the back of your minds as we talk today. The sum of things whose value can be measured in money, but notice that that does not include things like love, friendship, beauty, peace, and so many other things that are important to human life. In connection with wealth, two other things to define. One is riches, which I'm going to define as a personal accumulation of wealth, a personal accumulation of wealth, a kind of private abundance. And I'll explain why in a moment. In contrast with that, I'd like you to think about prosperity, which I suggest to you is the stable possession by a community of an abundance of wealth, the stable possession by a community of an abundance of wealth, a kind of shared abundance. And I think that underlying prosperity is a combination of abundance and simplicity. Abundance and simplicity. You know, we're fond of saying that many persons in vowed religious life take a vow of poverty. I think that's actually a misnomer. I don't think anyone takes a vow to live in deprivation, serious deprivation, to live in poor health, to live without adequate shelter and clothing, and so on and so on. Really what people do is take a vow of simplicity. And this aspect of simplicity, as Father Schlag so wonderfully said earlier, seems to be absent in much of modern society, developed society. So that's my bit of philosophy, but a bit of theology. When I teach students about the Catholic social tradition, I tell them that one of the foundations, I think, of the tradition, one of the foundational insights, is actually about 1,800 years old. It's found in the writings of Irenaeus, a Syrian bishop who ended his life as Bishop of Lyon in France. In his book, Let's Come Down to Us, Irenaeus said, "The glory of God is man fully alive." The glory of God is man fully alive. In the Old Testament, glory refers to the manifestation of goodness. So the leaves of a tree are the tree's glory. So think about that for a moment. The glory of God, the manifestation of God's goodness, is man fully alive. Not man as a servant, not man as a subject, not man deprived of reason or freedom, but man fully alive. The God of Israel, in contrast with the gods of other peoples at the time, is a God of abundance and generosity. God offers Israel stable prosperity. He offers Israel a situation in which the community will possess in a stable way an abundance of good things. And in order to ensure that stable prosperity, he offers them a covenant and a set of laws that will guarantee that prosperity. Israel, as most of us do personally, steps away from time to time from that covenant. The task of the prophets in Israel is to remind Israel of its covenantal responsibilities, to recall them to fidelity to the covenant so that they can continue to enjoy this prosperity that God wishes for them as a people. What we see again and again in the Old Testament is a contrast between the just man and the rich man. The just man and the rich man. The rich man pursues this private abundance and very often is criticized for his willingness to exploit others, for his deceit of others, for his greediness, and so on and so on. By contrast, the just man pursues, first of all, justice in his dealings. And what happens, and there are some lovely phrases in the Old Testament, what happens is that the just man is rewarded, but not through his own efforts. In other words, prosperity comes to the people of Israel through the actions of the just man, because it's through the actions of the just man that God is able to realize what he wishes to give to the people of Israel. So by pursuing justice, first of all, what results is a kind of prosperity for the people. Not simply for the individual, but for the people. That's an important point. The Old Testament and the New Testament are both aware of the dangers of riches. I mean by riches, the way I've defined it, this private possession of wealth. Think about that parable of the story of the young man who approaches Jesus, the rich young man who approaches Jesus. We find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in almost exactly the same words. It's a bit unusual. Jesus responds to his claim that he's obeyed the commandments throughout his lifetime by saying, well, what you need to do is give your money away. And the rich man leaves saddened because he's very wealthy. He's rich, not prosperous, but rich. He's attached to his wealth and isn't willing to give it up. Prosperity is not a bad thing. I hope you take that message away. It's not a bad thing. It's what God wishes for his people. Individual riches, especially those gained through injustice, are not what God wishes. And he wishes people to be detached, willing to use the wealth he wishes to give them for purposes that sometimes go beyond their immediate intentions. For the just man, the real source of prosperity for Israel and for others is God, not his own actions. In Rerum, Novarum, Leo XIII, one way of reading the encyclical is Leo XIII is responding to the new challenge that's posed by a renewed capacity to create wealth. In the early church, the fathers of the church really didn't imagine that wealth could be created, only redistributed. And so we read a great deal about giving to the poor and so on and so on. By the 19th century, and the end of the 19th century, 1891, when Rerum Novarum was released, it was clear that we had discovered new ways to create wealth, but these new ways to create wealth create new problems. So Leo responds to that by reminding people that wealth is always a gift. Prosperity is a gift. The wealth that we possess is to be used for God's purposes. He suggests that Christians need to approach wealth with a certain sort of detachment, a willingness to let it go, to use it for good purposes and not to cling to it. Specifically, he warns workers against the dangers of envy, but he urgently warns the wealthy that they have a solemn duty to use their wealth for the benefit of others. speak of this to my students, and I remind them of the Spider-Man principle. You know, to whom great things have been given, great things are expected. They've sort of heard of the gospel, but they know Spider-Man. So that's our philosophy and theology. What does wealth and what do virtues have to do with wealth and prosperity? Here's a thought. Humanity has an enormous amount of experience dealing with scarcity, dealing with poverty. That's the condition of much of humankind in the world today, and it is historically the condition of the world. We have relatively much less experience dealing with prosperity. We're much less clear about what qualities we need, what virtues we need in order to manage abundance well. Excuse me, but this has become a really pressing problem. We might not think of managing wealth as a pressing problem, but it really is. Someone once said, there are a great many people who would like to have $1 million, but what they really mean is they'd like to spend $1 million, right? The problem of managing wealth is something that faces us now. I suggest to you that prosperity is not a reward for virtue, but virtue is a necessary condition for prosperity. We can think of prosperity not just as an abundance, but also as a characteristic of a community. And this, by the way, may be a family, an organization, a nation. A characteristic of a community, thank you, that consists not only in an abundance of good things, but also the personal and cultural habits or virtues necessary to do four things: to obtain, create, preserve, and use wealth well. No one in the classic moral tradition can be a good person without being virtuous. At the same time, no culture can be successful unless it supports, fosters, celebrates, encourages, and sustains virtue in its members. Some of you will remember Peter Drucker, the management writer. Drucker once said, it's impossible to build a successful company on the backs of vicious people. It's just impossible to do that. You can't ignore the personal characteristics of the people who compose the organization. No culture is indifferent. Every culture fosters some kinds of habits in its members. And we need to be mindful of what habits we cultivate. So let me turn to that. What sorts of virtues help to create prosperity? Well, let's turn to the first aspect that I mentioned, obtaining wealth. I suggest to you that one of the principal virtues, and by the way, let me step back a moment. Father Schlag spoke to us about the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. I want to speak about some very particular virtues that are related to the management of wealth. And the first one I want to propose to you, I'm going to call fairness. Sometimes we speak about fairness as a synonym for justice, and indeed it can be that. But I want to call your attention to another aspect. We use the word fair sometimes to speak about things that are beautiful and pleasing. A fair day, a fair wind, a fair lass, and things of that sort. I think that we can speak about obtaining wealth, what Aristotle calls taking wealth, in other words, receiving something from someone else. He thinks of it, first of all, as a kind of commercial transaction. But we obtain wealth at times through transactions. Those transactions should not only be just, they should be fair. They should be pleasing. Fair transactions can't deny justice, but I think they have to build upon justice. So let me give you an example. We hear from time to time about businesses that seek to delight their customers. And I don't think that's a bad thing, that a business seeks to delight its customers. When it seeks to delight its customers, it seeks to give customers more than they expect. As I was getting off the airplane yesterday, the cabin attendant said, as we were getting ready to deplane, I hope we have delighted you on this flight today. Well, that's not really possible when you're sitting in coach. But they didn't do such a bad job. But I ran across a little story about an airline. It happened to be Southwest Airlines, but I'm not sure that it's either unique to them or unique to this particular incident. There was a man whose grandson was in a horrible traffic accident. He was living on the other side of the country. He was comatose. And the family knew that they needed to take him off life support. So the grandfather is frantically trying to get across the country so that he can see his grandson one last time. He misses a connection on Southwest Airlines. His flight is late, and not just a few minutes late, but really late. When he arrives at the airport, he discovers that the flight has been held. He gets on the plane, speaks to the pilot who's waiting for him. Everybody is waiting. Some irritated passengers, do you imagine? Everybody's waiting. But the pilot says to him, well, look, they can't leave without me, and I wasn't going to leave without you. It's a pilot, but think about this. Think about an organization that celebrates fairness. Think about an organization in which a pilot feels free to make that decision. Okay? I think it's a good example of fairness. Creating wealth, relatively new capacity for us socially. But here's a virtue, I think, that goes along with creating wealth, and my friend Michael Novak has written so eloquently about these. The virtue I want to suggest to you is empathy. Empathy. A capacity to perceive the real needs of the other and to be moved to respond to those needs. Let me give you a couple of quick examples of empathy. A fellow by the name of Matt Dalio formed a business called Endless Computers. A young man on a trip to India, he noticed that in many of the villages, poor villages, people had cell phones and they had television sets, but they didn't have computers. So this idea occurs to him. They have communication, but they don't have information. And information could be horribly important to them. Think about information about agriculture and all sorts of other things. So he spent 3 years. Many of you who have been involved with startup companies, you know what it takes to develop a new product and how difficult that can be. This is a for-profit company. It's not a not-for-profit, a for-profit company. He developed a small computer that can use television sets as a monitor. It sells for about $150. It works with intermittent electric supplies, so it's not going to be fried if the electricity suddenly goes out. It doesn't really even focus on internet connectivity because that's not very reliable, but it's loaded with information. Wikipedia, databases of information about agriculture, health, and so on and so on. Empathy, understanding what people need and devising a way to respond to that. Another example, some of you know Tom's Shoe Company. About 10 years ago, Blake McCoskey was in Argentina and noticed a number of children in the cities without shoes. And he thought, well, at least they should have shoes. So again, a for-profit company. He devised a company in which the promise of the company is for every pair of shoes they sell, they will give one away. They've distributed over the last 10 years 15 million pairs of shoes. I propose that you think about this as kind of a business problem. In other words, he's had to devise a way to make a product that he can sell at a profit to subsidize the donation of these shoes. It's not simply collecting money from others to give shoes away. It's a for-profit business. He's creating wealth. He's creating value in the process of doing this. So a third virtue, preserving wealth. Preserving wealth. Well, I'll tell you, in a time of negative interest rates, I have a little difficulty understanding why I should pay the bank to hold on to my money. The virtue I associate with preserving wealth is discipline. Discipline, a kind of caution about the use of wealth. Let me give you an example. The Vavilov Institute. Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry was located in Leningrad. It was perhaps the largest repository of seeds in the world. Something in excess of 100,000 different species represented in their vaults. Temperature-controlled, humidity-controlled vaults. Over 40,000 different hybrids of agricultural seeds. In 1941, the city of Leningrad was besieged by the German army. The siege lasted for 2.5 years, probably the most vicious siege of a city in the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands died in Leningrad. Many died of starvation, the largest collection of seeds in the world. 9 of the people working in the Vavilov Institute died of starvation to protect those seeds. One man died at his desk of starvation, and they succeeded in protecting the seeds. Discipline. They didn't spend the seeds. Can you imagine a more critical time to use the seeds and to provide them to people to eat? But they knew that something much more important was at risk if they did that. That's discipline. It's dramatic discipline. A fourth example, using wealth. And here the characteristic virtue is generosity. And it comes in a couple of different flavors. Generosity is a habit by which we give liberally. We give to the right person at the right time from the right resources. We give with pleasure and without pain, a characteristic of virtue. Aristotle noted that it's hard for the generous person or the generous community to be rich because the generous person is too willing to give away his wealth. It's also relatively easy to take advantage of the generous person. In a city like Washington, as in most large cities, you can walk around the streets of the city and be approached by people who ask you for money for various reasons. A generous person doesn't necessarily need a really good reason to give that person some money. Sometimes simply the idea that if this person needs money badly enough to be asking for it on the street, perhaps he needs it more than I do. It's easy to exploit a generous person. Let me give you a couple of examples of generosity. One you may recall from Les Miserables. Early in the play, early in the book, Jean Valjean, who spent nearly 20 years in prison brutally for the crime of stealing bread to try to feed his sister and her children, takes advantage of a bishop and steals some silverware from the bishop. He is apprehended by the police, who call the bishop to the station to press charges against Jean Valjean. And the bishop comes to the station, brings with him a couple of silver candlesticks, and says, "No, no, I gave him this. He forgot to take the candlesticks. Now go away and make something of your life." That's generosity. And we know that Jean Valjean in the story did make something of his life. Another example, the second flavor of generosity is what we sometimes call magnificence. Magnificence comes from a couple of Latin words meaning to do great things. Magnum facere, to do great things. Let me give you this example. From 1921 to 1932, Andrew Mellon was Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Even then, he was an elderly man. After his retirement from public life, he devoted himself, or actually returned to philanthropic activities. His family, headquartered in Pittsburgh, had donated greatly to the University of Pittsburgh. One of the donations eventually resulted in the merger of a program with Carnegie's University, now Carnegie Mellon University. But in 1935, the Roosevelt administration aggressively pursued Mellon, who was in his 80s by this point, on charges of tax evasion, tax violations. The litigation dragged on, but in early 1937, at the end of a process that he began nearly a decade earlier when he was still Treasury Secretary, Mellon donated the bulk of his art collection, valued at about $40 million, to the building of the National Gallery of Art. He also donated an additional $10 million to fund the construction of the building. Within a few months, Mellon was dead. A couple of months after that, he was entirely exonerated of the charges of tax violations. He didn't live to see that. But think about that magnificence. In the midst of being falsely accused of tax violations and being put through this extended litigation and all of the publicity that goes along with this, he donates $50 million to the nation for the construction of an art gallery. Now look, we know that people are not perfect. We know that we all do, except perhaps those of us in this room, we all do things that ought to embarrass us. We do things that are sinful and prideful and so on. I'm not suggesting that any of these people or any of these examples are perfect people who are above criticism, but they rise above their imperfections and do great things, and that's what virtue accomplishes. Now, I'll leave you with two questions. And these questions have to do with our culture and our organizations and our families. First question is, what do we do? Do we do enough to sustain fides in order to cultivate virtue? Here's what I mean by that. Fides, the Latin word fides, like the Greek word pistis, may mean belief or it may mean trust, confidence. People are able to cultivate virtue when they have belief that it's worthwhile and they have trust that things will turn out well. Do we do enough to cultivate fides in our organizations? The second question is, or do we permit fear, passion, and ignorance to dominate our organizations? Because in the face of fear, passion, and ignorance, we will not cultivate virtue. Some of you know the work of Edwards Deming, quality management and so on. One of Deming's firm principles, you may recall, for any organization that wished to pursue quality, and quality is not simply efficiency, remember that. For any organization that truly wished to pursue quality, one of the founding principles was drive out fear. Drive out fear. So do we do enough in our families, our organizations, and our nations to cultivate the virtues that we need for prosperity? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That's great. It's now a real honor to introduce Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. She is no stranger to this, or Pakaluk. She's no stranger to this conference. She was one of our initial speakers last year at Seaway Napa. She was also a speaker during the summer at the Napa Institute conference. All of her papers are received, with exceeding praise, and they're very practical and they're very deep in terms of the development of our faith. Dr. Pakaluk earned her Ph.D. in economics at Harvard University. She has since then become chair of the Department of Economics at Ave Maria University. She also is the founder and I think the key principal at the Stein Center for Social Research at Ave Maria University. She's published a variety of papers in many different subjects, of course, in economics, in social theory, but also areas that really concern the social encyclicals, concern family research. And of course, she won, I believe most of you know, the Novak Award for her research at the Acton Institute. So Dr. Pakaluk, it's great to have you back with us once more to inspire us.
you. Thanks, Father. Thank you so much. I'm here today to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the leonine foundations of human ecology. So, in other words, my goal is to tell you what Pope Leo provides by way of example and model for what we might now call human ecology. So there are two things wrong with my title. So the first thing is that when I say leonine, one might imagine that I'm going to spend a lot of time on all of Pope Leo's work, but in fact, I can't do that. We don't have enough time. So when I say Pope Leo, really I mean Rerum Novarum, and that's appropriate since we're celebrating the 125th anniversary of this document. Now, the second mistake in my title is I said the leonine foundations of human ecology, but the term human ecology isn't in Rerum Novarum. So, and you knew that. So if you go and kind of page search for ecology or human ecology in Rerum Novarum, you will not find it. So I have to do a little work for you. And so I want to proceed in three parts. First, I want to kind of give a little bit of background. Why are we even talking about human ecology today? What does human ecology actually sort of mean? And what are these leonine foundations? So really, at the end of the day, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes, maybe 15, on Pope Leo. So, now it's true that people who've spoken before me have already kind of given it, but I assumed that not all of you would have known why we're talking about human ecology. So, of course, there's the June 2015 encyclical letter of Papa Francesco on the care of our common home. And this encyclical isn't the origin of the term human ecology either, but it does place the concept or the notion of human ecology right sort of front and center. And in particular, I'll show you the beginning of the document and the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. And what this does is it kind of wants Francis wants to place a highlight there on the tradition of what I'm going to call unity in the Church's teaching on the natural environment and the moral law. So I found this cartoon. The elephant on the left says, "Let me see, I just want the traditional marriage appetizer and the no abortion special, please." And Pope Francis is taking the menu in the middle. And on the right-hand side, we have, "Just give me an order of economic inequality," followed by "The man-made climate change is real" entree, right? So this is a little bit funny, but the point is that this term human ecology, when Pope Francis introduces it at the beginning of Laudato Si, is meant to highlight the unity between these two things, right? So that we don't get this ridiculous sort of political idea that these things can't possibly be put together. And so this is fair. Okay. So that's kind of the end to the cartoon part of the talk. So, of course, I'm going to move right. Now, I apologize if you can't see. We're such a large group. If you can't see this text exactly, I'll try to read. So I'm first just going to introduce us to the paragraphs here, and I'm going to focus on this unity between the care for the home and the. So really briefly, so this is from Laudato Si, paragraph 4. So we're right at the beginning, right before the Pope has gotten into all kinds of specifics. We're right at the beginning, and he wants to remind you right at the beginning, this didn't come from him. He's not making it up. So he's going to refer back to the earlier popes and where he's coming from. So he refers first to Paul VI, and he talks about this ecological concern as a tragic consequence of unchecked human activity. And I'm going to read at the end, the most extraordinary scientific advances, the most amazing technical abilities, astonishing economic growth, unless they are accompanied by authentic social and moral progress, will definitively turn against man. So we have the idea that it might be possible to imagine economic progress or human development without kind of moral or complete fulfillment of the person. So he's highlighting this unity again. So to sum up, before I continue then, we're talking about human ecology because Pope Francis made it front and center of his concerns about our common home. And because, as Andrew mentioned earlier, we kind of have this problem. Something is wrong in our relationship with reality. Bless you. Further, man cannot be steward of nature, cannot stand over nature and be steward of nature without being steward of himself. If he's part of nature, he has to be steward of himself. And that being steward of oneself requires understanding oneself, right? There's a kind of study of what it is that I'm steward of. I'm not a very good gardener, actually. I kill all the plants. But I'd have to understand the plants to be good steward. This is very clear. So one can't be steward of what one does not know, and one can't be steward of oneself if one does not know oneself. And this is what some people will call this kind of anthropocentrism of Catholic social doctrine that's kind of always bringing us back to, well, wait a second, what is man after all? And that kind of gets talked about a lot. So, so this is why we're talking about human ecology at all. What does human ecology actually mean? And this is going to be very brief, but I'm going to make an attempt to kind of orient things a little bit. So taken together, these quotations we have already, I want to say that I think, I sort of skipped a slide. Well, that's okay, we'll move on. So what does human ecology actually mean? They're kind of two concepts. And this sort of looks a little bit complicated, but it's fairly simple. So these two concepts are simply this. The first is the one I just mentioned, that man is just not self-creating freedom, that he's part of nature and has to learn and study nature and then accept himself, accept his relationship with nature and with others and with God, and I'll make that point in a minute, that freedom arises when he respects his nature, that this, I'm going to call this dependence, a kind of radical dependence, and that we didn't create ourselves like the chair. We will go out of existence if we don't depend upon, it's not up to us. We depend upon God whether we want to or not. But what we understand from the Catholic tradition is that God wants us to kind of accept this. We have to accept that we're the chair that will disappear if we take the creator away. It's true whether we want it to be true or not true. So we are not pure will. We do not create reality. God is pure will, and in fact tells us a great deal about his will through nature. So this first concept of human ecology is a kind of posture. Church will use the name posture, a kind of orientation to reality. And I would say even with respect to the kind of discovery of truth. A posture with respect to reality. Not only is reality real, but reality is normative. So this is where we get this unity of the two sides of things. Reality is not just real, but it's normative. What does it mean to be normative? It's normative, right? So a norm is a rule or a law. Reality is normative because it was created by a rule giver, a norm giver. And that norm giver is the author of reality. So we can learn about the way things ought to be, norms, from the way things are. This is interesting. So the second part of human ecology is the part that should be very familiar to us, and it's the part that we share with our secular peers. That man belongs at the center of a complex web of relationships, that men are not born into society, but conceived in a womb and born into a family. So this is this sense that man is part of this complex web of relationships with the environment, with other people, and with God, right? This thing that we always think about, which I'll move forward, this kind of sense that we have from our textbooks, that we're kind of part of this complicated cycle. This is the second concept. So I'm going to call this interdependence, right? So the Catechism states, man is not a solitary being, right? So he's completely dependent upon God for all things, on other men, and on his environment, including nature, culture, institutions, etc. So it's important to separate these two concepts of human ecology because it gets us clear about why it is that we sometimes seem to be speaking on different planes with our peers. It's ecology in the first sense, which is a kind of acceptance of reality as real and as normative. That distinguishes us from our secular peers. The second sense is something that we really share, and that we're all kind of in the last 50 years spending a lot more time thinking about, both in the secular literature and academia and in the culture. It's important. So, of course, Benedict XVI and Pope Francis think that by highlighting the way in which we do share a concern for this important, not just a concern, certainly you could argue that if you were to read all the way back through Catholic social doctrine to the beginning, what you one way to sum that up, there are many ways to sum that up, would be to say, really, that there's this constant insistence, right, that men are not islands, right, that men are completely dependent, that this is a kind of constant. So Benedict and Francis think, well, hey, look, we've got this. In fact, we kind of cornered the market on we're all interdependent. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you, the truth is when I was younger, and I associated the term interdependence with a certain brand of political liberalism that I didn't like, I thought, well, that just has to be book. But then I read more widely among the medieval authors. And in fact, St. Catherine of Siena spends a lot of time talking about interdependence. I thought, well, this can't belong to the left if we've been talking about it since the Middle Ages. So it turns out that actually we own all good things in the end, right? At least that's the way I'll put it. So, so now, just for a moment, I want to help you see where I've said a couple times that the church didn't invent the term human ecology. And it's generally credited to a great developmental psychologist by the name of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who is a Russian-born American. He actually had 6 children. I didn't know this until I was preparing this. He had 6 children. He spent most of his career at Cornell. This is a kind of picture of one of perhaps his most famous book, The Ecology of Human Development. And he's credited with this thing. So this is his great image, right? So this is something he was working on in the late 60s and the early 70s. And his point was kind of, look, like the individual's in the middle of this big complicated system. So this is called, human ecological theory, ecological systems theory, and there's a bunch of related names for this. But you can see this thing that will remind you again of your textbooks from when you were in 7th grade about the animals and the rain and things eating each other. But in any case, there's the individuals in the middle, and we have this microsystem and a mesosystem and an exosystem. This is what Yuri Bronfenbrenner did, and then he took the whole thing and put it in 3 dimensions and said that this, of course, it evolves over time, so this is very interesting. So this is the sort of secular concept of human ecology, where it came from, and what most people think of when we talk about this. So just to show you what a great guy Yuri Bronfenbrenner is, I grabbed a couple of quotations. Those of you who have children, who've raised children, will know that this is so true. In order to develop normally, this is what Yuri says, in order to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have irrational emotional relationship, an irrational emotional relationship with the child. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number 1, first, last, and always. Or this other one, every child needs at least one adult who is irrationally crazy about him or her. So this is just to give you a sense of what kind of a guy Yuri was. He had his 6 children, and I guess his children were doing okay, right? So he's irrationally attached to them. Children need people in order to become human. And remember that in the 60s and the 70s, he's in a context of the developmental psychologist where people are proposing perhaps, people don't need people. We have the Skinner boxes. We've got all kinds of crazy stuff going on in psychology where we're kind of experimenting with these really cruel ways of thinking about the development of the person. And Yuri's saying, no, this is ridiculous, right? That people only develop in relation to other people. Right? So this radical interdependence. So this secular notion of human ecology is not terribly different from the one that we would want to advance, that the church would want to advance. So I have, I gave you this, these are images from your 7th grade textbook. Just to break up all the quotes, okay, really. So, and then here just, again, it's just not something, I actually just bring you this definition from the encyclopedia, not to read it for you, I won't read it for you, but to show you how similar it is to what Pope Francis talks about in Laudato Si, this kind of ecology, this is Pope Francis, ecology studies the relationship between the living organisms and the environment. So in the second sense of human ecology, the church is really is building on and interacting with a robust and kind of very interesting tradition in psychology and cultural studies, right? So here's another just little tidbit from Pope Francis. If everything is related, then the health of a society's institutions has consequences for the environment and the quality of human life. And I could go on. It's someone else's job, I think, at this conference to tell you a lot more about Laudato Si. So I have to get to Leo before I'm done. So before I get to Leo, I want to bring you back to that first sense of ecology, because it gets exciting. We start to talk about Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and we can speak the language of interconnectedness too. But I kind of want to bring us back to this first piece of human ecology, because I can't do the connection to Pope Leo without bringing us back to that first sense of human ecology, which is the part that's about accepting reality as real and as normative. So I want to say that this really is the most important part of the enterprise. And I've re-given you one of the same quotes I gave you before, or part of it, actually kind of given you the back part of it. So this is from that same address to the Bundestag. Benedict says, he talks about this legal positivist Kelsen, who I guess in his old age abandoned the dualism between what is and what ought to be. And he said, well, previously the scholar had said that norms can only come from the will. Nature, therefore, or reality, could only contain norms if a will had put them there. Now, this is very logical. And he rejected this because he said, well, if nature could contain norms, it would presuppose a creator God whose will had entered into nature. So Pope Benedict says, well, is it really pointless, therefore, to wonder whether objective reason that manifests itself in nature does not presuppose a creative reason? And so then in that light, let's go back to that first quote, which I quoted earlier. The importance of ecology is no longer disputed, and then Benedict says we have to listen to the language of nature and answer accordingly. So there is this ecology of man. And then he says man isn't self-creating freedom. So you can see that there's this idea in the background that nature actually contains for us a kind of set of norms. And that this thing that we do when we take reality as normative is pretty central to what we're up to. Notice, by the way, and I'll mention this a little bit more later with the quotations from Leo, that this really is a kind of radical rejection of something like factual or aspirational individualism. You can't get out of this any sense of sort of factual or aspirational individualism. And there's an articulation here of human flourishing in which good and appropriate dependence relationships are actually deepened and strengthened. Okay, so did say 11 minutes for Leo. So turning to Rerum Novarum, can we find any foundations for this? And of course, I'm going to say the answer is yes, because what remains the same over time about Catholic social thought is that in spite of the contingencies of various situations and times and papal personalities, if you will, social doctrine is always an exercise in thinking with the mind of the Church. So we certainly see these same concepts and posture, I will say this, postures, present already in Rerum Novarum. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of each of the types. So there's type 1 of this kind of concept of human ecology and type 2. And as I've said, type 1 is kind of more important. It's not the whole thing, but it's very important. So right at the beginning, now remember that Rerum Novarum is answering, right, it's answering a mistake of the socialists. So that these particular examples that I'm bringing to you, many of them relate to the notion of private property. It's not that this is the only way, it's not that private property is the only sense in which we could work out human ecology type 1, which is this nature as real, nature as normative. But that's just what Rerum Novarum is. So don't take the private property thing to be itself important. What I want to highlight here is how much and how often Leo is going to build his argument from nature. This is not accidental, and I'll show you in a few minutes that although this seems natural for us to read it if you've grown up in the Catholic tradition or you received a Catholic education, this is not normal. This is not normal. This is uniquely Leo's, or it's uniquely something that people in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition do, right? So we have right at the beginning. So what he says is against justice. He says what they propose, what the socialists propose is manifestly against justice. Okay, so just flag that for yourself. So justice is linked to nature. For every man has by nature the right to possess property as his own. So I'm emphasizing the argument is from nature, not the right to possession, although I think it's true. But I'm going to emphasize this argument from nature. So I've actually had to take out a whole bunch of this. This is from paragraph 6. It was too long. But then again, he says about animal nature. He talks about animal nature, and he talks about human nature. Animal nature, however perfect, is far from representing the human being in its completeness. So he starts to sort of try to unpack what is a person by nature. And what's striking when you read through these paragraphs, later Catholic social teaching and doctrine, and even in Leo, if you read through all of Leo's writings, he makes a lot of footnotes, references lots and lots of documents, but not here. In these paragraphs, he simply wants to make a philosophical argument coming from nature. So this is not a minor finding, and I'm going to show you some other. This is not a minor finding, that the primary purpose of Rerum Novarum was to respond to the problem of workers. And he sets about to do two things: to reject the answer of the socialists and then to propose alternative solutions based in true justice and solidarity. And he appeals to the nature of things in both cases. So the next paragraph right after that, notice how he begins this paragraph. This becomes still more clearly evident if man's nature be considered even more deeply. So as if what he just did wasn't to say it deep enough. He says, let's even think about man's nature more deeply. And this goes on for many paragraphs. It's very interesting. So here's an example. Man's needs do not die out, but they forever recur. Although satisfied today, they demand fresh supplies for tomorrow. Nature accordingly must have given to man a source that is stable and remaining always with him, from which he might look to draw continual supplies. And this stable condition of things he finds in the earth and its fruits, and so this is his defense. So notice here that now nature is capitalized. So nature. So his philosophical argument depends upon the idea that nature, behind nature, there's a kind of a norm giver. Nature must have set things up in a certain way, right? This is why nature is capitalized. And of course, Leo's going to suppose that it's not ours to change the way nature is. So here I want to let, right after in paragraphs 9 and 11, let sort of Leo speak for himself. He says again, we have further proof that private ownership is in accordance with the law of nature. He keeps saying this over and over. It's like, why does he keep saying this? It's like kind of like a broken record. Now, when man thus turns the activities of his mind and the strength of his body towards procuring the fruits of nature, that portion on which he leaves, as it were, the impress of his personality. That's a great theme, by the way, the relationship between work and the development of the personality, which comes up later in Catholic social doctrine. Private ownership, therefore, is in accordance with the law of nature. And then again, with the common opinion of mankind, has found that in the careful study of nature, the laws of nature, the foundations of the division of property, that this has been preeminently found to be in conformity with human nature. This is like again and again. So, but here's my most interesting slide. Okay, all right. So this is just as on a whim, I thought, let me go check. Like, how interesting is this that Leo does this? So here's Rerum Novarum. In Rerum Novarum, there are at least 33 uses of the term nature. There are 69 uses of the term law or laws. And there are 52 uses of the word just or justice. In the Communist Manifesto, there are 2 uses of the term nature. There are 4 uses of the term law or laws, and there are 0 uses of the term just or justice. In the Principles of Communism, there are 0 uses of the terms of nature, 3 uses of law or laws, and 0 uses of just or justice. In the Communist Confession of Faith, there are 0 uses of any of those terms. So I think, this is a very quick argument. This should help to impress upon you that what the church is doing when she builds arguments based on nature, it's not something that everyone does. This is special to us, or special to those people who are working generally in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. It's amazing. If I had asked you in advance, how many times do you think Marx and Engels appealed to the sense of justice about things, you would have thought they appealed to it all the time. Isn't this whole thing about justice? Well, it's not, actually. It's not about justice. So this is very interesting. When I showed this to one of my students, she said, wow, so really they're not actually interested in appealing to what's just. They actually want to tell us how things should be, but without, right? So this is interesting. So briefly, I have a couple minutes. So this is really it. We could stop right now, because this is my most interesting slide, I think. But if you want to see that you can also find the second type, the second notion of human ecology also in Pope Leo, I have 3 examples for you. And there are more, but I sense, it's not a lot of time. So 3 examples. So the first example is that this right to private property, which I already highlighted, for Leo, it's not for the individual. It's not for the sake of the individual. And he says here, this right is seen in much stronger light. It's a stronger right when we understand man's relation to other men, to his social and domestic obligations. So he grounds the right to private property ultimately after his arguments from nature, which can be taken on their own terms. He says they're proved to belong naturally to individual persons, yes, but they must and likewise belong to a man in his capacity as head of a family. Right, so this is where we really are going to differ in this interpretation of the right to private property from the individualists, from the utilitarians, right? We're going to say that this is about the way it is that we are as communal persons. It's the most sacred law of nature, there it is again, that a father should provide food and all necessaries for those whom he has begotten. So it's a right we protect for the father so that he can give something to his children. And that you're going to find that pattern over and over. This is where we own this thing, this interconnectedness, this relatedness, this kind of second part of human ecology. So another example of that, very quickly, is, here's another 12 and 13. I won't read through these, I don't have time. The second example is a little bit touchier, but it's interesting that it's there, and I want you to have seen it, which is the kind of defense of factual inequality in nature as the basis for social and political cohesion. So he talks about this, and he says, well, socialists may, in that intent, do in their utmost, but striving against nature is in vain. And what does he say that the socialists want to do? To reduce civil society to one dead level, to get rid of all inequalities, right? And he says, look, there exist by nature differences between people. And he says, this isn't bad, this isn't disadvantageous, so long as, right, we're not saying all inequality is good, but we're saying that the fact that there's inequality isn't on the surface isn't bad. Why? Because without inequality, we have no need for each other. There's nothing to give each other. I'm not better at something than you, and you're not. So it's the basis for the kind of social cohesion we're looking for. And he's concerned that if the socialists get what they want, it kind of just actually sort of reduces things to one dead and uninteresting level where everybody's kind of equal. So this is another interesting, so the basis for something later we think about the interconnectedness. It's important to think that a precondition for love and a precondition for cohesion or unity is inequality. We have to be different. The difference doesn't necessarily imply any difference in dignity, right? But that we have to, there's something different about us. Right? So this is the second point. And the third point is simply that we have in Pope Leo the beginning of this great doctrine of solidarity. He says, if Christian precepts prevail, this is where he starts to answer. How are we going to answer the socialists if it's not socialism? How are we going to answer them? If Christian concepts prevail, the respective classes will not only be united in the bonds of friendship, but also those of brotherly love. Right? And he goes on to talk about brotherly love. And so solidarity begins with this fact, with the notion that we are not islands, but brothers. And this is not a doctrine of social indifference, and I'll just leave with you the final tidbit that what we have described here is something like the idea that the error of socialism and the error of collectivism are not two opposite extremes or two errors, but kind of one error, like one same error of kind of getting it wrong about this interconnectedness of people. So the individualists deny that there's interconnectedness, and the collectivists would like to put all of the dependence somewhere else on the collective, not within personal relationships that are given by nature, right? So this explicit intention to destroy the family, which has been present in socialist thought from the beginning. Don't want to depend upon the father, rather depend upon the state, right? But it's the same error. It's not opposite extremes of different errors. So of course, there's a lot more I could say about these things, but I hope I've given you just a little bit to chew on, where we can understand this concept of human ecology and how fair it is and right to honor Pope Leo, not only as the father of Catholic social doctrine, but also the model for our reflections on human ecology. Thank you.